What's up, everybody? You are listening to the Credentials Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sterenberg, and we've got another phenomenal episode for you today. Today, we're talking with Dr. Ethan Hutt. He's an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he's talking with us about the history of the student record, the history of transcripts, and basically our educational system today. He also is the author of a book, Off the Mark, and that's about basically our grading system, our pursuit of achievement and grades, and kind of the challenges of that system, the pros and cons of it. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm kind of a history nerd, so this is right up my alley, but I think he does a really good job of addressing, like, what are the unintended consequences of some of this stuff, and what are the reasons why these things persist. If you're a registrar, I think this is a really fascinating conversation. So without further ado, let's get to our conversation with Dr. Ethan Hutt. Let's go. All right, I'm here with Ethan Hutt, Associate Professor of Education at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I found you because you wrote a paper on the brief history of the student record, and you're also the author of this book, Off the Mark, which is a phenomenal read. And I'm not just saying that because you're on the podcast.
Thanks for the plug,
It's great. I actually highly recommend. I really think anyone involved in education can read it. It's very readable, and there's a lot we could dig into today. But I'll pass it over to you. How did you get interested in student records, grades? How did this happen?
It's funny because, I think it started, as an education historian, you gravitate towards things that are records. But I actually am just really fascinated by how really simply, like how things that fade into the background of like our everyday work actually control really important parts of how organizations work, how school is experienced. And so I just got really fascinated by this idea that, education is really complicated, but we need a very simple way to record who's doing what for how long. And like everyone agrees that this is like maybe not the optimal way to do it, but it's like really useful. And so it's just balance. And so I've always been really interested in this, the core challenge that's at the heart of student records, which is how do you communicate to a broader audience that isn't in the classroom, like about the work of schools. So that's how I got interested in, like you said about the book, interested in grades, tests, student records, Carnegie units, like all the mechanics of schooling that really have a kind of outsized influence on the work of educators, on the experience of students. I just find it endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, and reading the book, it's really, I found myself underlining a lot of things, and it's just enlightening and also depressing, to be honest, in a certain way, where you're just like, and you say this in your article, the student record is basically a series of compromises. And that's how it feels reading your book, where it's like, well, we could do this approach, but here are the downsides of this approach. And so I think that's just, let's just address that there's not going to be we're not going to solve it today. And there's going to be more compromises. It's just a matter of what we want to emphasize. But if you could, Ethan, like walk us through the brief history of the student record, like what are some of the evolutions of the student record as to get to today?
Yeah, so like it starts out where you have to understand that in the beginning of school, there are no records. And like it's a really important like to understand that you need records because you're trying to communicate with an audience that is not present, that's like in the future, and that you need something that's durable. So in the early days of schooling at the college level, all students are taking the same courses. So the idea that you would have to have some kind of mechanism to equate courses in different subjects or different lengths of time, it's like when everyone's taking the same thing, you don't need that. So it's important to understand that like you can have education and you can make certain decisions about the structure of that education or who the audience for, hey, how's it going in class is right there. They don't need you to write anything down. They don't need you to preserve anything. And you don't need, sort of accounting mechanisms because everyone's doing the same thing. Like if UNC decided tomorrow all students are taking the same thing, we wouldn't need credits. You just say like, well, did you pass all your classes? So there is a time well into basically the start of the 20th century where most colleges have pretty standard track, and there is no recording other than maybe they're recording like honors, that a student who does particularly well. Maybe they're recording grades, though. This idea of like course rank, or that the idea that you would go on beyond that, or that you would need something like a GPA, just doesn't. That's not like a thing that's in demand. Basically at the turn of the 20th century, you get a lot more people finishing high school, and you get a big expansion of colleges, and people are interested in colleges. You also get, starting at Harvard and Michigan, places that are really starting to think like, a lot of more students are in college now, and they don't all want the classical track. They don't all want, Latin and stuff. We want to provide some electives. We want to provide some choice. We're introducing things like science into the curriculum. We're creating science schools like the Sheffield School at Yale. And so there's a sense that like, okay, the one track everybody's on it is starting to fall. Harvard famously creates its elective system. And then you start introducing this problem of like, okay, how do we equate things? And at the time, there was a view that, the brain was basically a muscle. And so as long as courses were flexing that muscle in about the same way, you could kind of equate them, which was originally the kind of idea about the length of time being a proxy for, challenging subject, the same amount of time of exercise, so they can be equated. This gets more formally introduced with like the Carnegie unit. Carnegie comes around and in one sense is trying to separate high school level work from college level work, but basically standardizes this idea that seat time is going to be the thing that equates different subjects, and the accumulation of a certain amount of time doing certain kinds of things is going to be how you earn a high school degree, and then the high school degree makes it. So that's where you begin to see people, and this is right around the turn of the 20th century, 1910, 1920s, that people are beginning to talk about credits, and this idea that like units are kind of like a currency in grading. After that, you see like a proliferation of people trying to figure out like, and this is one thing that is, I'm sure registrars will be very familiar with, when and this is where currency also helps as a language. If we both have schools and I say, Matt, I'm going to take your units, if you take my units, you're basically acknowledging each other as being part of the same system, as being at some level equal in that exchange. So colleges start becoming much more accustomed to sharing students, about transferring credits, recognizing credits at other places, trying to standardize like how much credit are we going to give for certain kinds of things or certain activities, how many credits do we want to have students do in certain kinds of fields. And so you begin to sort of see the system begin to come together and concretize around this idea of, okay, if we're colleges of a similar quality, we want to have the same level of rigor. That means the same number of units, the same amount of time in key subjects. And so that kind of dominates in the basically the first half of the 20th century. And then in the sort of like the 60s and 70s, you get a lot of people saying like what a lot of people say now, which is like, is time really the best measure? And like, what about things that, are these units really the same? And gee, if you just pass a class, you get the same amount of credit, and that you can use further. And like, we should actually get underneath the credit and see what kids are actually learning. And so this sort of concern that like, well, maybe a credit and a unit isn't the same, it isn't equivalent, or shouldn't be. There's a big question in the 60s, especially as you get non-traditional students, both GIs coming back from the war, but just an expansion of who is in higher education as desegregation kind of falls away, or is being displaced at a lot of institutions. And you get a big study in the 60s and 70s of trying to find alternative ways. Carnegie launches this big study, should we revisit the credit hour? And it's kind of funny because they ultimately come down to, this is what you were alluding to before, which is kind of works more like than it breaks. So this idea that we want to really poke at things, or we want schools to be reevaluating each other's credit, like really puts some of the smoothness in risk. And so the task force on educational credit, which was what the group was called, and it was the American Council on Education that did this. Carnegie was very involved as well. Kind of says like we could do worse than what we have, and they kind of leave it alone. You do see pockets of other people doing narrative grades and alternative things or certification for activities outside of things, but basically we revisit it and we kind of say like leave well enough alone. And that's why that's kind of where we are today is we've tweaked things, but the core technology has pretty much stayed the same since like the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's the benefits and drawbacks of it, the standardization. You think about the registrar, like what is their life on a day-to-day basis? It's, articulation agreements, it's transfer credit. You have students that are increasingly mobile, thinking more about choice. And the last thing you want to do is upend a system and make it harder for students to transfer, right? I've lost credits or whatever it may be. I mean, maybe that whole system gets thrown out so we don't have to like think about it like credits. I mean, part of the challenge is, thinking about the students we're impacting immediately and not necessarily down the road, right? The people that have credits, what happens to those students? But that's the life of a registrar is trying to give credit to the right people so that they can persist to a degree, continue and get that valuable credential, right?
That's exactly right. And there's the other part, which is like, people say, oh, you should open it up. That's like, oh, it's too tight and this is, the information is too sparse. And it's like, yeah, but there's something really, as you're saying, there's like a sacred trust that you put in a registrar where you say like, I may have started my credential and then I have taken time off. And it's really important that when I get back, that those credits or that there's some record that I did that or I had a certain number of units or that they were there and they were recorded. There's a big debate in the 50s, that this idea of like the record system is too big. You can't just use last names. And so they start saying like, well, we need to find like unique identifiers, and they start using social security numbers. And there's like a huge concern about the privacy around this. And okay, granted, but it's like, no, but we need to make sure that the credits are yours, that we can identify who it is. And as people get really, get much more mobile, as the universe of where students are going, it used to be very, very regional. And now I think a lot of registrars are, it's not just national, it's international. So it's really important this sort of that the simplicity of the record keeping and that it's located in one place and that the student record is someone's responsibility and is not just like throw it on the blockchain or like throw it open and just let people put whatever they want on there. It's like there's a real drawbacks to that kind of thing. And it's, as you say, like it's not that we couldn't think of other ways to record or other things that we might want to put on a transcript, but the simplicity is what makes it valuable and manageable, and then that it's housed with the registrar and not shared among a whole bunch of other people. There's real wisdom in that kind of approach.
Yeah, and you highlight this really well in the book too, which is if these things are going to be currency, they have to be widely accepted. If it's going to have any value at all, it has to be understood and has to be valued, has to be transferable. And so that's absolutely critical, right? And that's the value of the system that we have today largely. So I do want to like dig into micro-credentialing and badging, which you highlight in the book too, which you highlighted, is time and seat really the measure that we should be having? And there's this move to competency-based education and badging and micro-credentialing. And it's solving kind of a clear problem, which is, what did you really learn in this class? You got a B in Latin American history, but what did you really learn? And we have kind of a binary system today with a clear problem. So many people have some college with no degree, so I have nothing to show for it. And kind of badging is, let's get you some credentials along the way. But, it's not a perfect system either. And you highlight kind of the over credentialing, and kind of the commodification
Yes.
of going after credentials, which I think is really interesting. Dig into that a little bit
So
for
I mean,
me.
like, so one critique, of degrees is that they're commodities, right? Like, I want to get my units so that I can get my degree, and the degree is valuable to me because I can exchange it for a job, and so they talk about just, and we've all had this where, a student comes in like, I don't care what class it is. What's the easiest way for me to get the 3 units I need to graduate? Like, everyone who's been involved in education has either had that conversation directly or been adjacent to it. And so there's this critique that, like, that, and it's a totally reasonable one, which is that we've turned, with grades and credits and degrees, we've turned education into a commodity, something that's most valuable as an exchange as opposed to what the credential actually represents. And the challenge of micro credentials or badging is like, it just amplifies that, right? You've turned one credential into potentially like many sub credentials and commodities. So one of the questions that we have is, and I think you framed the trade-off really nicely, which is, if the question is, okay, we have students who are partially finished with a degree and have nothing to show for it because they haven't earned enough to finish, can we credential them in the things that they are actually demonstrated mastery and accomplished? That may be something where we say, like, that's a good trade because we're actually providing them with the potential to exchange or get recognized a certain set of skills that otherwise would not be visible, and they would have no currency on it. And that may be an instance where, like, that makes a ton of sense to try to, you know, break up a degree into certain kinds of skills that then allow students to make those visible and trade on them. I think in another context where often it's like we're talking about, okay, we want to burnish the CVs or the resumes of high school students. Let's give them a bunch of badges. Like, let's turn the high school curriculum basically into like a Boy Scout badge. And now you have, like, instead of like 10 units that you're evaluating, or now you have an infinite number. And to the point that I said before, like, a lot of times one of the challenges of the badging world is that it's often even more decentralized in our schools. So, whereas, my high school issues those credits and those units and the degree, the diploma, and same with the colleges. There are a lot of online institutions, companies of various quality, and it becomes really hard. And, like, to push the currency metaphor, one of the most dangerous things in a currency environment is banks issuing bad currency, because it pollutes everything. And then people start to either question the value, they start to worry. So, you get this sort of, you want kind of a tighter control. So the idea of just like, oh, we should allow infinite badging, that solves the problem. It's like, it doesn't really solve the commodification problem. It also doesn't. The other challenge of diplomas and transcripts that you suggest is the information is really thin. We call it the thinness problem of the information, where, like, letters and, as you said, like, the name of the course aren't always as rich in information as we would like. It doesn't really solve that problem either, because, again, unless you know something about the issuing body of the micro credential or the badge, it's one thing if it's like Google decides they're going to credential people in some kind of, I don't know, whatever, computer science. It's another if it's like, the ABC Academy has issued this, and then it's like, then you get into this problem. So that's the issue, and that's something that colleges have often really struggled with, is like, who do you let in and who do you recognize? When community colleges massively expanded in the 50s and 60s, the articulation agreement was a real point of contention. It still is. Like, and that, again, is talking about the relative stance of institutions with respect to each other. And that's the kind of, like, brave new world of the badging and credentialing conversation. Is universities are going to have to decide how much they're going to lend it, or if they're going to do it themselves, which would be, like I said, probably a better solution, because at least they know what the badge means and who's issuing it.
Yeah, it feels like we're always going to end up in some sort of cycle with this, where it's like, all right, badging, competency-based, well-intended. We've got to credential people as they pursue, we just don't want to have the binary degree, not degreed. And we want to have like the metadata. We want to have the course descriptions. People have to understand what this badge means. But at the same point, like you said, it's kind of the Wild West right now where some colleges, we talk to people and they're like, I don't know what badges are going out, right? And that's not a good thing, right? So what are the badges for credit? Are they on a path to credit? And then what's the cycle that we might be in? It's like, well, then we've got to standardize it. And then once you standardize, innovation becomes a little bit more of a challenge. And so it's just funny. Like it always seems like you end up with, you're always going to have trade-offs. You're going to have some we solve here and we have issues here. That's just the way it feels sometimes. And that's why I made a joke, but like, that's why your book it's a great book, but it's like depressing in the sense that you're like,
you're not the first person who said that. We would have sold both more copies of the book if we had just said, there are 3 simple ways. Here's a hack.
Right,
There's like 3 simple ways to fix the school system. But I think anyone, honestly, we tried. Our editor was like pushing, like, can you give us some, something hopeful? And we're like, like my family has a lot of educators in it, and I've been in, school my whole life. And you just like, if you've been around schools, you just know that these simple things the reason we have imperfect solutions is because the problems are complicated and people's situations are complicated. And we have a massive system. Like, the thing that I often say to folks when they're like, well, we need, you just fix it. It's like, well, would you trade institutional autonomy for, getting rid of some of these things? Because, in a lot of other countries, especially at the high school level, they are happy to get rid of standardized tests or have less emphasis, but they insist that everyone takes the same courses and that everyone use the same textbooks and everyone reads this. Like, you get standardization somewhere. And so the big challenge I think the single, it's hard for registrars, sorry registrars, but like the best part about the American system is the diversity of institutions. We have a bunch of different institutions that have all decided to do things a little bit differently and in their own way. And we have this like delightful diversity of schools.
And it's one of our greatest exports still
to this day. It is our greatest export. It's the best success. Like, everyone comes and tries to figure out, like, how did America do this? And it's like, we always, on the backs of registrars, like, we literally built the system or we built a bunch of institutions and then tried to later figure out how to make it a system. Like, so all of these things were retrofitting a system together through basically, accounting devices to try to make it standardized. And like, we feel the creaks of that kind of retrofit all the time. But for my money, it's like, that's a good trade. It may not be that every credit is exactly the same at every institution, but the fact that you can move institutions or you can move states, and it's close enough. I think that actually is a good trade. I'd much rather have that than to say, every school in America, every college in America has the same curriculum. They use the same textbooks. It's the same 4 pathways through. There are no new majors. There's no, like, all the innovation of our schools is predicated on like, well, you can kind of port in like units and hours and things. I mean, that, so it's like, you got to kind of deal with the hand wavy part, but it allows for a tremendous, diversity of institutions and forms and innovation. And so like, that's the trade-off.
One of the themes in your book that continues to come up is just, in the pursuit of grades, we are not focused on actual learning. It's, you give the example of, the question that gets asked a lot with the idea of going to college and having the best kind of admissions profile. Like, should I take an AP course and get a B, or should I take a regular course and get an A? And you're like, well, what's lost in this is no one's asking like, what course is going to teach me more? Where am I going to learn more? But one of the themes that I think comes up a lot is it seems like it's written from the perspective of someone who loves to learn. And so it, like, as I was reading it, I was like, I totally agree in some respects, but is the transactional nature a bad thing? like I'm learning to get to this next step. What's the tension there
Oh,
of learning to learn and learning to get to the next thing?
so Jack, my co-author, he loves to learn. I just like to get things done. So I'm actually so I actually think my advisor, David Lavery, he always argues that like the best that actually, and I tend to agree with this, is like the idea that a student is going to come into my class and figure out the the path of least resistance, if that's what makes sense to them. um, I actually think that is a tremendous skill. For my money, it's like when people say, for all the critiques that we get about grades and how, oh, grades don't actually represent learning, and actually, GPA is the single best predictor. High school GPA is a better predictor of how students are going to do in college than like the standard test scores like the SAT or the ACT. And I actually think that that's partly because it is a very important skill to sort of assess, like, okay, what is being asked of me, what is actually being required. And I think students are hyper rational when they come to, like, students are really good at calibrating their effort to exactly what it is that they need. Now sometimes that can backfire, can actually dissuade students because they sort of make the calculation like the upside isn't there for me, so I'm actually not gonna dedicate myself, and that has a really long like tail, like consequences, where like they don't ever get the skills because they've decided that no matter how hard they work, or they don't have the bandwidth to work as hard as they would need, and so the grade motivates them to actually like not work as hard as they might otherwise. But I actually think it's a reasonable like skill, and that's kind of why in the
We do it
book
every day in
yeah.
our jobs, in
Oh,
our, like, what is going to be the most efficient way I can mow the lawn and make dinner tonight?
completely.
Like,
and
yeah.
and when you're in a job, you're like, okay, I have multiple tasks. We really need like three of me, but there's only one, so I have to manage. And I do think that that kind of balancing and that kind of calculation makes a ton of sense. It's also like kind of why in the book we end up not in the like we should get rid of grades. It's, our argument is that if we can move and adjust our tasks in our courses so that the kind of gaming and the kind of um, decisions that students make are at least around tasks or things that we think have real value. So there it's, because I think a lot of times I'll admit it, you sort of say, I need things for my gradebook. I need to make sure that I'm assessing at some kind of like, so maybe I'll do a little thing here or a little thing there. And it's like, that's probably stuff we should cut out. We should really make sure that the things that we are focusing students' attention on because they care about their grades, those are really high in the skills or the dispositions or the experiences that we want students most to learn. So we talk about the importance of the use value of things, like try to make things not for their own sake, but to some core purpose. And if students want to game around those activities, like that's better. That's a better outcome than if they're gaming around, silly busy work. So yeah, we don't come out against grades or tests because we actually think that that calculation is just, you're not going to get rid of it. That's how and grades motivate students. We know this. So why take away the motivation? We should just better align the things that we are grading or the things that we're rewarding and the things that we would say we care about when we want a student to take Latin American history or something like that.
So last question for you, Ethan. So at Parchment and Structure, obviously, it's all about digital credentialing at Parchment, and how we initially, it was moving things from analog to digital, right? And then how do we send it as data, and how do we transfer this information a lot better? And now it's kind of like thinking about how we elevate it and not just make it easier to, we don't want to just do something that isn't great more efficiently. Let's actually start to reimagine it. And as we're talking with institutions, this is at the top of mind for us. Like, how do we think about a comprehensive learner record? What does that even look like? Is it a more holistic representation of my time at this institution? Is it a holistic representation of my entire educational experience? How is that curated? Who owns the record? Institutions or students? Big question, but just generally, I want your 2 cents on how do we reimagine the student record and what guardrails should we be thinking about?
I mean, so the first is like, I do think that you have to, one of the things that has made records successful in the past is that they have been owned by one person, and the number of people that have the ability to write to inscribe on the student record is kept to a minimum. So people know, like, who the instructor gave the grade, not the registrar, not, it's like reflects the instructor's judgment. And that's kind of a sacred thing. Like, no one can change my grade as an instructor. That's where I etch. And the school owns it, and they're the ones who name the courses. So I mean, I do think that that's a strength that's worth preserving. One thing that I do think goes to a real core problem, or no, a real core limitation to a transcript that in the past was a necessity because of the nature of record keeping. Record keeping was physical. There were rooms with file cabinets, and the amount of information that you could store reasonably was small, and it was really finite. Now, as you've alluded to, like, the digital world has totally changed that. So, like, one thing that I think we say in the book that I think is very much in your wheelhouse, and I think is very much goes to a core critique of what student records are, is that we can never really see what's behind the grade. So I get a B in Latin American history, and like, what does that mean? What did I do? And the ability up for us now to make grades, what we call in the book, like double clickable, like to see behind that, to say like, okay, the final paper, it would be really easy for a college to say, for instance, the final paper, the final project, some version of it has to be basically attached to the transcript. That it gets uploaded to whatever the LMS is, and it goes to the grade. And so everyone knows. I do think that a lot of times we trade on the fact that no one will ever look behind the grade. It's why students are able to kind of argue with us, like, give me one more point, give me one, because like that's the only thing that matters, because no one will ever see the final exam that's behind it. So, attaching a syllabus and a final paper to every grade, not because everyone's going to want to look, like there really is a value to economy of communication, but there are some people that would be interested in looking behind. That seems something that is very, very doable. It doesn't change the basic mechanics of who gets to like inscribe on the transcript. Like it maintains the strength of like very few points of intervention, but I think it could massively improve both the dynamics around grading, because if a student knows that the paper that they wrote, that maybe is not actually an A, like follows them around, they may take it more seriously, and it may actually frame the learning object as a more serious and enduring thing, not just the grade, or at least it puts it on equal footing. So that's something that I think feels very much within the capacity of like our technology. It addresses a limitation that was an actual physical world material limitation of the past that we don't necessarily have anymore, and kind of changes some of the dynamics. So that's like, if I had one wish, that would be the big one, is that we make it a standard practice to do that kind of thing, and build out kind of from there. That's like the top of my wish list.
Ethan, great to talk to you. And another plug, get the book Off the Mark, you and Jack Schneider. I really did enjoy it, and I think if you're in education, you're going to enjoy it too.
Well, thanks for having me. It was great to chat with you. And like I said, the registrar, we need a little statue of registrars on all campuses, because they're the ones who actually make all the back end stuff work.
That is our episode. Thank you again to Ethan for joining us. Fascinating conversation. What really struck me at the end is just him talking about like kind of the clickable transcript, like the ability to at least drill in to what the course entails. And for us at Parchment, now that we're part of Instructure, I think that's really cool. That's what we're trying to get to. How can we communicate more information about what the student has learned and what they've accomplished? That's kind of the whole idea of Instructure and Parchment coming together, is connecting the system of learning with the representation of that learning, which is the credential. And so that's really cool and something that obviously we're going to continue to think about as a company. This podcast isn't a plug for our company or anything like that, but I do think that's kind of a cool thing to take with us, is that there is a need for this and that it's kind of validated by people that have looked at this system and know that it can't be completely changed, but needs to be innovated. So great conversation. Appreciate Ethan. And check out the book Off the Mark. I really do think it's a great read, very readable. So if you're interested in the conversation today, I think you'll really enjoy it. But that's our episode. Thanks so much for listening. Smash that like button and subscribe. But we'll talk to you all real soon. Goodbye.